Welcome to this lecture series on organizational behavior. We are in this chapter, organizational culture. This is the second lecture in this chapter. I'll quickly summarize what happened in the previous lecture. We defined culture. We also looked at how culture can influence individuals. We also looked at different levels of culture and more specifically what it means, what does organizational culture mean. We also looked at how certain professionals can have shared values within themselves. So there are cultural values which are specifically for certain professions. We also looked at how different levels of culture and different layers of culture can influence an individual's behavior in workplace. We also looked at organizational culture. So organizational culture is like personality of the organization. For individuals, personality is the core of the individual's behavior. Similarly, for organizations, culture is the core of the organization's behavior. How an organization behaves depends on the culture of the organization. We also looked at how organizations belonging to different sector can have similar cultural practices depending on the motive which drives that sector. So this is where we stopped. So we are going to look at a very interesting model on cultural dimensions, or an interesting approach to understand organizational culture. This model is proposed by Hofstede. It's a very popular model in organizational behavior context to understand organizational culture. So according to Hofstede, originally Hofstede suggested 5 dimensions which is found in any organization as a cultural dimensions. So these 5 dimensions are power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism, collectivism, masculinity, femininity, and long-term orientation. So I'll explain each of those dimensions in detail. Power distance, so these are values. These are values, cultural values. Each organization will possess, and it reflects the culture of the organization. So the first dimension, power distance, it means to what extent the members of the organization value power. Okay, when I say value power, it means to what extent power is considered to be an important quality, or to what extent power is respected in the organization. So if someone has a lot of power in the organization, or if someone is in a powerful position, what kind of respect people show to this person. Okay, so it also reflects upon to what extent people seek power in the organization, and this also denotes the inequality in terms of power which exists in the organization. When I say inequality of power, some people in the organization will have high levels of power, some people will have very less power. Vis-a-vis organizations which have low power distance, power will be equally distributed. In other words, everybody will have more or less equal amount of say in decision making. On the other hand, when organizations have high levels of power distance, some people will have very, very less opportunities to be part of decision making situations, but some people will influence a lot of decisions which affect many people in the organization. Okay, so some of the symptoms of power distance, high power distances, like I mentioned, people will value power in the organization, people will show a lot of respect and fear to people with high levels of power. The second cultural dimension, or the value system, cultural value, is uncertainty avoidance. Uncertainty avoidance means to what extent people are very uncomfortable with uncertainty. When I say uncomfortable with uncertainty, it denotes to what extent people expect precision and planning in whatever they do. So in cultures or in organizations which have high levels of uncertainty avoidance, they will have clear-cut rules in terms of how things has to be done, what procedures to be followed, how processes should be defined, how jobs should be prescribed, or how job characteristics should be clearly defined. So all these clear-cut rules and regulations denote that the organization doesn't prefer uncertainty. Okay, so only when someone avoids uncertainty, they will look for rules and procedures which will avoid uncertainty, which will reduce uncertainty. Cultures which are very high in uncertainty or very less in uncertainty avoidance, they tend to have very few rules. There will be no clear-cut prescription in terms of what is correct, what is not, how things has to be done, and things like that. Okay. For example, Eastern cultures are considered to be low in uncertainty avoidance. Like country like India, we are okay with uncertainty. We are okay with chaos. But certain cultures, Western cultures, like some European countries, like Germany, they prefer everything to be clearly written down and everything to be very certain. For example, the trains are like very, very precise in terms of the running time. Okay, they follow a very strict punctual schedule for everything. For example, Japanese are supposed to be very high in uncertainty avoidance, which means everything is like very precise. They are very particular about punctuality. So all these management ideas, Japanese management ideas, like just in time. Just in time means even going early is not correct. If you have committed yourself to be in a place at, let's say, 5 p.m., you have to be there at 5 p.m., not 4:40 or 4:50, or not 5:10 or 5:15. Okay, so that denotes they don't like deviation, or they don't like uncertainty. Okay, so there are advantages in in both sides. So cultures which are very low in uncertainty avoidance, they are okay with chaos, and they are very good in creative tasks because they are okay with working in tasks which are not clearly defined. On the other hand, for processes which has to be very clearly defined, especially quality related aspects, quality related dimensions, you need very precise prescription of what is allowed and what is not allowed. So for that, you need very high levels of uncertainty avoidance. So some cultures, some organizations, they have high uncertainty avoidance. Some cultures, they have low. Some organizations have low uncertainty avoidance. So again, these are like continuum. Even power distance, low power distance, high power distance. So it is like a scale. Organizations can fall anywhere in between this scale. The third dimension is individualism, collectivism, which means individualism means to what extent the particular group values individual rights, to what extent it values the choices made by individuals and individual decision making. On the other hand, organizations or societies which prefer collectivism are those organizations prefer or they favor decisions made as groups, and more than individuals, the group welfare is considered to be more important. So in extreme cases, it also means individuals should forego their rights in order to help the larger group to prosper. Okay, so for example, Japanese culture is found to be very high in terms of collectivism. US culture is found to be very low in collectivism, or they are very high in individualism. So some organizations, it is okay to have individualistic cultures, especially when the organizations, the employees has to work as individuals, and also it is okay, or if you need to encourage competition between individuals, then individualistic kind of culture will work better. On the other hand, if the organization requires collaborative work processes, it requires members or employees to help each other, in a work in a collaborative manner, then collectivism will fit into the organizational culture better. Masculinity femininity means masculinity dimension or masculinity value insist upon strength and achievement. On the other hand, femininity value insists upon collectivism or nurturing everyone in the group, working together as a group, preferring compassion more than competitiveness. Okay, so some organizations which are very achievement oriented, they reflect masculinity value dimension. Organizations which reflect nurturing their employees, working together as a group, helping each other, those kind of organizations denote femininity kind of cultures. Again, which value, whether masculinity or femininity, will suit a particular organization depends upon the nature of the business they are in, the nature of the processes which they handle. Long-term orientation means the focus, whether the focus of the group is on long-term benefits or short-term benefits. Some organizations or some social groups, they prefer long-term benefits over short-term benefits. So they are okay with foregoing short-term benefits for the sake of long-term benefits. So this is like postponing your immediate gratification for the sake of long-term sustainable profits. Organizations or groups which are very high in or very low in long-term orientation, they prefer short-term benefits rather than long-term benefits. Again, which one is more successful depends on the context, the processes which are involved in the organization, things like that. But from a sustainability point of view, long-term orientation is considered to be more preferable. So how are these dimensions reflected in day-to-day work behavior? For example, if an organization is very high in power distance, the employees are encouraged to value power, and their respect towards seniors is reinforced, or sometimes fear towards seniors or people who are at higher positions is reinforced. And these kind of organizations are like very tall structures. So there'll be very few people at the top, and there are more people at the bottom. Similarly, uncertainty avoidance, these kind of organizations, employees, if there are low levels of uncertainty avoidance, people will be very creative, creativity will be encouraged. On the other hand, when there are high levels of uncertainty avoidance, people at a very high levels, people will be asked to wear uniforms, or there will be a very strict dress code and things like that. In organizations which have high levels of individualism, rewards will be given to people for individual achievement. On the other hand, organizations which are high in collectivism, group rewards will be preferred more than individual rewards. And team players will be considered to be good employees rather than individual achievers. Organizations where femininity is encouraged, the organization will ensure all the employees are their welfare is taken care of, their individual skills are nurtured, their families are also, there will be policies which will be very family friendly. On the other hand, masculinity or the value system related to masculinity, if it is high in organizations, those organizations will insist on achievement, and they will have policies like hire and fire. So if you don't perform, you'll be fired. And aggressive behavior will also be encouraged. Organizations which focus on long-term orientation, they prefer their employees to stay there in the organization for very long years. So your duration of membership in the organization will be valued more than your immediate performance. Similarly, the other way around, when long-term orientation is low, these kind of organizations prefer employees to perform from day one. So they don't worry if you are there for 10 years or 15 years. If you don't perform, you're out of the organization. So these are some ways in which cultural dimensions get reflected in day-to-day practices of the organization. Okay. So in terms of organizational culture, apart from these dimensions, there are other dimensions which are also found in organizations, and they reflect the organizational culture. attention to detail. So again, attention to detail is similar to uncertainty avoidance. Outcome orientation, which is similar to masculinity or individualism. People orientation is similar to collectivism and femininity. Team orientation is again similar to collectivism or femininity. Aggressiveness is similar to masculinity. Stability is similar to long-term orientation. Innovation and risk-taking is similar to uncertainty avoidance. So organizations which are low in uncertainty avoidance, they take more risk and they encourage innovation. Okay. So there are different approaches to understand organizational culture. So Hofstede's model is one such framework. There are also other frameworks which are available, but Hofstede's model is more preferred and mostly used by many studies on organizational culture. Okay, so there's another way to look at organizational culture is strong culture versus weak culture. So when you say strong culture, organizations which have strong cultures are characteristics by group members being very cohesive, and all the group members strongly believe in the cultural values. So, let's say a group or an organization which has strong culture, then all the members will strictly reinforce this cultural values on each other, and everybody will believe that this particular belief system, this particular value system of their organization or the social group is very valuable, and also they will feel it is the truth, or this value system is the only thing which is correct. Okay, in other words, there'll be more dogmatic also. In a very extreme level, when there is strong culture within the organization, there'll be less deviation in the group, and they might also have very strong resistance to change. So in organizations which have strong culture, there'll be a lot of pressure on people to comply to the cultural values. Even the slightest deviation will not be accepted. And strong culture influence managers strongly. So when the organization's culture is very strong, managers will feel a lot of pressure to comply to those cultural values and also reinforce them on their employees. So they'll have pressure from both ways. One, they have to follow all these cultural values, and they should also reinforce it on the employees strongly. So what leads to strong culture? Organizational size. Especially when the organization is very big, there'll be subcultures. So subcultures means there'll be different types of cultures among the subgroups of the organization. So we'll look at subculture in the next slide. But broadly, it means if there are many subgroups in the organization and each group have different cultures, unique culture of their own, it will reduce the larger organizational strength of the culture, or the larger organization's cultural strength. So size, if the organization is very large, there are more chances subgroups will be formed, and that will lead to subgroup formation, and thus the larger organizational culture will lose its strength. Tenure of the organization. If the organization is there for very long time, and if the employee turnover is less, if the members of the organization stay in the organization for very long years, and also if the organization is there for many years, then the culture will be strong, because the same kind of people who are there for very long years, many years, they tend to withhold their organizational cultural values. They will not allow the newcomers to change the value system. Okay, and also leadership, especially if the leadership is very strong and the leadership is there for the same leader is there for many years, the culture of the organization will be very strong. And the problems with strong organizational culture is, like I said earlier, there will be a lot of resistance to change, and there will be less creativity in the group, and also slightest deviation in the group will be treated with a lot of force. There will be a lot of pressure on people to not deviate from the organizational culture. But the advantage of strong culture is the group will be very cohesive, they'll be very focused, they will cooperate with each other better. They will, they'll show respect to each other in the group if the culture is strong. Okay. Apart from strong culture, weak culture, there's another classification: dominant culture and subculture. So if the organization is very big and there are many subgroups in the organization, there'll be two levels of culture. One, there'll be dominant culture. Dominant culture means there are certain value systems the entire organization will share. And also there are some subgroup or subculture values which is shared only among the smaller groups within the organization. So the smaller groups can be in terms of horizontal groups, which means different departments or different work units, or it can be vertical groups, which means levels. So let's say in a very tall kind of an organization which is very large, depending on the level of the organization, the cultural values may change. For example, at a very bottom level, there'll be very low uncertainty avoidance, or sorry, there'll be very high uncertainty avoidance. At low levels, people may avoid taking risk. But high levels, like top level management, people will be encouraged to be more creative and take more risk. Similarly, vertically also, some departments will be encouraged to take more risk. For example, sales and advertisement or sales and marketing department, they'll be encouraged to be very creative. So the uncertainty avoidance will be very low. On the other hand, manufacturing units of the same organization, they need more quality control and more precision. So there probably there'll be very high levels of uncertainty avoidance. But throughout the organization, there'll be some values everyone will share. For example, in a country like India, there are some values, some cultural beliefs. Throughout India, we all share as Indians. At the same time, each state also has its own unique cultural values, which is subculture. So when there are too many subcultures and the subcultural values tend to overpower the dominant culture, then there'll be less cohesiveness in the group. But if the dominant culture is very, very strong, then it can also lead to problems, because the subcultures will feel that there is no freedom for them to adapt, or there is no freedom for them to behave in their own culture. Or in other words, they may feel they have a certain unique culture because of that particular social group which belongs to a larger social group. So if the larger social group insists upon its values on the smaller social group, the smaller social group will feel we don't have freedom or we are losing our identity. So that can also lead to conflict. So there should always be a balance between the impact of dominant culture and the resistance from the subculture. So it's a very dynamic process. Okay. So how to create, sustain and transmit culture? So any organization, culture is formed by the founder's vision, mission and attitudes. So if the organization is new, whatever the founding members, their priorities, their dream for the organization, that becomes the culture of the organization in long run. So if the founder wants an organization to be a very creative, very egalitarian kind of an organization, very equality driven organization, then over a period of time, the organization will also be a very flat, very creative driven or equality driven kind of an organization. It can be other way around also. If the founder wants everything under his or her control, he or she wants more power inequalities will be more in the organization. That will lead to high power distance in the organization. So culture of an organization starts with the founder's vision, mission and attitudes. And even after the leader leaves the organization, the culture stays alive. So how does it stay alive? It stays alive through certain practices, mainly recruitment practices. When organizations recruit people, they try to ensure that the newcomers fit into the culture of the organization. Let's say if the organization respects equality and femininity kind of culture, but the candidate looks very, very aggressive and very competitive. He or she is not a team player. He or she may not get recruited. Or other way around, the organization looks for competitiveness and aggressiveness, but the candidate is like very compassionate, looks like a very soft, gentle kind of a person, very compassionate person. He or she may not be selected in the organization. So when an organization is found by the founding members, they will ensure that they will recruit people at the next level based on the value system they want the organization to follow. Similarly, the level next to it also recruited by these people who represent the leader. So it continues over a period of time. And also actions from the top management. What is rewarded in the organization? What kind of behaviors are rewarded? Do you reward tenure of an employee, or do you reward performance of an employee, or is there a balance? Do you reward team players, or do you reward individual achievers? So all those things sends signals to the employees. And thirdly, socialization method. When a new joinee enters into the organization, for him or her to learn what is expected out of him, he or she understands it from what people do around her. So if people around her behave in a way which represents a certain culture, the newcomer also believes that this is what is expected from her also. For example, power distance, which is represented by how do you address your supervisor or senior members. So if you address your senior members like sir, ma'am, you know that there is high power distance. You know that people are valued based on their hierarchy. On the other hand, if everybody calls each other by their first name, then you know that this organization is very equality oriented. So this is how newcomers learn culture, by interacting with others. So this is what is called socialization. If you remember in personality chapter also, we spoke about socialization. So employees learn through socialization, new employees. They also learn through other expressions of culture, which means there are certain cues they get from the organization. Sometimes these cues can be physical also. For example, what kind of seating people get. For example, if everybody gets similar furniture, then it means the organization is equality oriented. But some organizations you will see based on your level, you will get a better room or better furniture, better facilities. Then it means this organization value hierarchy or power. So these are some of the symbols people unknowingly, unconsciously capture, and then they'll understand what is valued in the organization. So these are some of the common expressions of organizational culture. Or this is how culture is represented in organization. At a very evident level, it can be physical artifacts. So once you enter into an organization for the first time, what kind of things are there in the organization? For example, let's say if there's a painting about war, or if there's a painting or if there's a huge picture of a race car or a military equipment, okay, or there is or the kind of music they play in the organization. So all those things show what is valued in the organization at a very, very physical level. Okay, things like what kind of furniture, are there differences in terms of furniture? Even the simplest thing like are they using cubicles as office space or office facility, or are they using independent rooms? So all these things denote the value system of the organization. Similarly, language and jargons used. So the first expression, which is physical artifacts, you don't need to interact with anyone. Just by looking at it, you will know. The second level is you talk to people. What jargons they use, what terminologies they use, how do they address seniors, how do they, what are their job titles called. For example, some job titles in some organizations, there are titles which are like very, very sensitive to gender differences. Okay, so instead of chairman, they will use chairperson. Okay, so which means there is some thought process on gender equality. The equality within gender is respected. Okay, the kind of languages they use. And also the kind of stories and myths and legends which is there in the organization. So for this, you need to stay in the organization for a little more time. Okay, the first level, you don't need to talk to people. You are just looking at things, you will understand certain things. Second level, language jargons, you need to talk to people. Third level, you need to be there for some time. You know, the kind of gossips which go in the organization, the kind of stories they talk. So the kind of myths which is shared. So for example, in one organization, I've heard that the CEO knows the birthdays of almost all employees of the organization. Personally, he knows. Okay, so it can be a myth also. It can be not true also. Okay, some organizations, this is personally I have encountered. The CEO of the organization sends mail to each of the employee on their birthday or their family member's birthday. So it shows the CEO or the person at the top is concerned about the welfare of the employee and also welfare of the family of the employee. So kind of a feministic kind of a culture, collectivistic culture. And also what kind of ceremonies and celebrations are conducted. So some organizations, there'll be like celebrations which value the founder's birthday or birthday parties. So what kind of ceremonies are celebrated? For birthday party of all the employees. For example, some organizations every month, one day they will celebrate the birthday parties of all the employees who are born on that month. Okay, so it says we value each one of the employees. And there can be routines, rituals and rites, which means rituals are symbolic things. For what purpose staff meetings are held? In some organizations, even for simple decisions, there'll be meetings, which means the organization respects the voice of each and every employee. How training programs are given? In your appraisal form, what are the questions which are there? So for example, if the question in the appraisal form asks about how long are you here in the organization, then it means it values your stay in the organization vis-a-vis how much did you perform or what is your level of performance. Okay, all those things. And also annual visits, picnics, all those things denote the cultural values of the organization. Behavioral norms. Behavioral norms means what is right, what is wrong, what is allowed, what is not. So all these things you will understand only when you stay there in the organization for long. Okay. For example, do they have common mess or common place where everybody can eat, or do they have separate eating places for people of different levels, separate parking spaces or for different levels? So all these things denote what is valued in the organization. Or do you have to get up when your boss enters your office, or what kind of dress code is there? All those things are behavioral norms which require some time for the employee to understand. Finally, shared beliefs and values. This is like very, very core of the culture of the organization, which takes a lot of time for a person to understand. It is kind of a perceived understanding of the culture of the organization. This is not written anywhere, but these shared beliefs and values gets reflected in many of these other expressions like behavioral norms, routines, stories, language used, physical artifacts and things like that. Okay. And finally, basic assumptions, even more underlying factors. So like I said earlier, basic assumptions are like the core, and above that there are shared values, beliefs, and then above that behavioral norms, above that routines and rights, and then finally physical artifacts. Okay, so how will you change an organization's culture, or do you have to change? Sometimes when the organization is is there for very long years, it can lead to a very closed kind of a culture. Especially if the culture is very strong, it can be suffocating for new employees. Or if the environmental conditions change, you should also change. For example, if you are a very feministic kind of a culture, but the environment demands you to be very aggressive, you have to change. Similarly, you are an organization which is very individualistic, but the newer generation expects very collectivistic or low uncertainty avoidance. As an organization, you should also change. So how will you how should one change the organizational culture? So if you want to adapt to organization environmental changes, you need to change. But at the same time, it takes a lot of time for people to adapt to new culture. Changing a culture is not that easy. Okay, so there are cases for and against changing organizational culture. Changing is good because if the environment changes, you have to change. Changing is difficult, so you cannot every time change the culture whenever you feel like. Okay, because unlearning something takes a lot of time. So when will organizational culture change, or when should organizational culture change? One, if there's a dramatic crisis, if the organization is undergoing a very major change like merger and acquisition or turnaround. Turnaround means they are making a lot of loss. A new leader comes and tries to change things. So leadership turnover, new leader comes. Life cycle stage. If you're on a certain life cycle, if you're a small organization till that point, but now you're growing in a very fast pace. So you cannot have the same kind of cultural values like that of a small organization because you're growing fast. You need to change your cultural values also. Similarly, age of the organization, especially if they are there for very long years, it becomes the organizations become very complacent. So to break the complacency, you need to change the culture. Size of the organization. If the size of the organization is very large, suddenly if the organization grows many folds, then there will be subculture. If there are many subculture, obviously the current culture, the dominant culture will be threatened or it will change. And strength of the current culture. If the current culture is weak, then it is very easy to change the current culture. But on the other hand, if the current culture is very strong, it is difficult to do that. Absence of subcultures. Like I said earlier, if there are very few subcultures, you cannot easily change the culture. If there are many subcultures, then you can change the culture because there is no dominant culture as such. Okay, so this is the end of the chapter. So we will look at organizational change as a chapter in the next lecture. Okay, till then, take care. We'll meet in the next lecture.